All right, we're back with the rest of the Civil War. Once again, we're not necessarily going to get really in depth with all of the fighting. I mean, in fact, if you read your textbook, it's kind of like a little bit dizzying what's going on, with the Civil War. But we'll try and do as best we can to, basically look at the major fighting, major battles, and kind of put it all into context. I'm going to pull up some of the pictures here from the Civil War that are part of your guided notes, and there's a few extra ones that I want to bring up here. Um, some of the battle maps, for instance, that including Vicksburg, Lee's retreat, Gettysburg, and then also the kind of the invasion of Maryland. So we'll get back to these a little bit, but let's start back where we ended, which is at the end of the First Battle of Manassas, right? Remember that this is actually a big Confederate win, a surprising Confederate win. All of the North kind of comes out thinking that they'll get a rout, but the South shows up, and they basically, pour on, led by Stonewall Jackson, and are able to defeat the Union and cause them to retreat and rout them on the way. Now, what happens after this? Well, George B. McClellan replaces General Irvin McDowell. Robert E. Lee will become the commander of the Confederates in Virginia. His army is known as the Army of Northern Virginia. All right, and this is the major force, the primary military force of the Confederates. So the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac, those will be the forces that are fighting each other in the east. So when we look at these battle maps, okay, this is Army of Potomac, Army of Northern Virginia that are fighting. Out here in Vicksburg, right, in the Western campaign, this is not those forces, right? These are different forces. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're clear where Lee is primarily fighting. Okay, Lee is not fighting out here in the West. All right. Anyway, what we get though in the beginning of 1862 is what is known as the Antietam campaign. Okay, and this will culminate in the Battle of Antietam in the fall of 1862. Okay. Lee is trying to attack the North at this stage, which is weird. If you remember, the best strategy or the best advantage that the South has is that they don't need to fight an offensive war. They just have to fight a defensive war. But Lee, being aggressive, decides that he wants to attack the North, and he wants to destroy a rail depot in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Okay, so Harrisburg is up here. You can see right there, just northeast of Gettysburg. So to do this, he marches his armies north, kind of flanking around Washington, D.C. You can see his forces kind of move through Chantilly or Ox Hill. They have another battle, the Second Battle of Bull Run. They win it. They keep moving north. They more or less converge on this area known as Sharpsburg or Antietam Creek, depending on what your what your naming system is. And this is the bloodiest day in U.S. history. Okay, there are 60,000 Union troops versus 30,000 Confederates. So once again, we see a massive outnumbering of the South. This is McClellan versus Lee, and it's incredibly deadly. 9 generals die, 22,000 are dead, wounded, or missing. Okay, but this is a Union win. This is a major Union win. Okay, and Lee is not going to be able to strike this blow to the North. Not going to be able to reach the railroad depot. And also, Britain and France, which are the two major powers that Lee is trying to court in terms of actually, supporting them, really are not going to join as a result of this loss. Britain isn't necessarily really keen to join anyway, or really both of them aren't because of slavery, but they're definitely not going to want to join a losing side. Bloody Lane is a famous location in this battle. Let me actually reload the picture here. This was an area in Antietam where basically the Confederates were completely mown down on this road and really piled up 2 or 3 bodies deep. Okay, let me get back to this picture. For some reason it's not loading. You can pull it up here. So, unbelievable death, unprecedented amounts of death, really, and once again, the Confederates are turned back as a result. There it is. There's Bloody Lane. Okay, so this was actually, after some of the uh, bodies have been removed, but it's a sunken lane. And look at the devastation around it, right? Look at the trees in the background, right? Just blown apart by artillery. This really looks like kind of like a no man's land from World War II. If you look at Bloody Lane today, some modern pictures, it actually looks, quite peaceful. And that's the funny thing about all of these. There it is right there, right? All of these pictures of modern day battlefields, it's like, oh, it's so peaceful, we'll go for a walk there. But really, they were just spots of insane carnage at the time. At the same time as winning, all right, so General McClellan wins the battle. He makes a giant blunder. He doesn't act swiftly in the beginning to attack Lee. He actually had captured Lee's orders and outnumbered him 2-1, but he didn't know that he had numbered them, right? So he could have actually just completely clobbered Lee's army, but chooses not to strike a decisive blow. He also could have pursued him at the end of the battle and maybe destroyed even more of Lee's army. Lee loses a fourth of his army, okay? But he doesn't. He doesn't do this. He kind of is hesitant to act and really strike this fatal blow for Lee's army. So he is relieved of command, and he's replaced with Ambrose Burnside. Okay, Ambrose Burnside. And Ambrose Burnside, we got a picture of him. This is the guy who we get the name of the sideburns, right? So if you ever heard of sideburns, it's from this guy, right? Look at that woolly beard, right? Even though we don't see necessarily big sideburns here, this is where we get that term. So Ambrose Burnside will be the new Union commander, okay? Antietam is critical, of course, like I said, because it marked a turning point. Lee turned back and didn't capture Harrisburg, and Britain and France will not support. Okay. Also, the Emancipation Proclamation will come out of this battle. So, right after this battle is fought, Lincoln passes the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees not all slaves, but all slaves in the Confederate States. Okay, so border states still have slavery even after the Emancipation Proclamation. All right, I'm actually going to skip the next section of generals and soldiers, and we're going to go straight into Gettysburg, okay? So another year will pass, all right? And, once again, we're in a position where Lee is going to be kind of desperate, okay? And he is going to be looking to strike, once again, a truly decisive blow at the North. Again, once again, if you're thinking, well, why is this happening? It doesn't make sense that Lee would attack the North. You're right. Okay, you're right. But in the Gettysburg campaign, all right, the idea was that if Lee could defeat the Union army in its own territory and relieve Virginia of the burden of war, okay, he would basically strengthen the power of peace Democrats, and peace Democrats are Northerners who want to end the war, right? So they're people who want to get out of the war, potentially undermining Lincoln's chances to get reelected, which would be huge because Lincoln is hell-bent on winning. And also, if they strike a decisive blow, it could reopen the possibility of European assistance. So, for all of the maybe ill-advised actions for Antietam, Gettysburg basically shows Lee's desperation. He doesn't necessarily want to do this. Doesn't matter if he wants to or not. He kind of has to show other powers, hey, we can fight, right? And we can win. So anyway, on July 1st, July 3rd, this battle rages. It's the largest battle ever fought on the North American continent before or since. 170,000 fight with 40,000 casualties. So this will be the biggest amount of casualties for any battle in the Civil War. This battle is fought over shoes. Okay, so there's a rumor that a massive pile of shoes were located in the area. And the Confederate General A.P. Hill, all right, he is the one that approaches Gettysburg to get the shoes, all right? And, the Union General, General John Buford, basically meets him in this area, all right? And basically they start the congregating of the war, okay? We're not going to go over why, but we have another commander of Union Army, General George Meade, okay, is going to pursue Lee into Pennsylvania with 95,000 troops. Okay, so we got a showdown, right? A massive showdown for battle. Here's the actual military map here, so we'll pull this up. Okay, so here's a good picture of, once again, Lee's forces led, General Ewell, A.P. Hill, and Longstreet are moving, flanking kind of through the foothills of the Shenandoah Mountains and kind of coming around and meeting in Gettysburg, right? Once again, the idea is to seize Harrisburg, but they're turned back at the end of June, and they meet here. All of the armies basically converge here at Gettysburg. So, all right, what happens? Well, this, of all the battles that are kind of laid out in your textbook, this one's laid out decently well. Basically, both sides arrive to the town. They fight to the north of it initially, gradually pushing through the town into the south. Okay, what happens is there's a series of hills to the south of town: Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and then two other small hills, Little Round Top, and also just Big Round Top, or regular Round Top. And what happens is there's massive fighting to control these hills, right? Because from these hills, Union artillery can fire down on the Confederate advance, and on Little Round Top and Big Round Top, we have a Colonel, Joshua Chamberlain, who is able to fight voraciously to take these two hills and prevents the Confederate capture or Confederate surrounding of the Union Army. So, this was amazingly effective strategy for the Union, and enables them basically to preserve their army and win. Okay. At the end of the battle, we have a famous charge of the center lines, known as Pickett's Charge, where 14,000 Confederate troops make one less desperate attempt to cross an open field in front of the main artillery line, and they get mowed down. Right. So it's kind of one of those melancholy lost cause moments for the South, in which you see the bravery of the Confederates marching, running across the field to their deaths. Okay. This battle is incredibly deadly. The Confederates lose 28,000 troops, a third of the victory. The hopes of victory are dashed in the war, and of course it signals the complete end of any sort of European intervention. So this is the spot where truly Lee will be turned back, and the North will gain an amazingly upper hand. Sorry. All right, now on to the end of the war. Okay, as we get closer to 1864, all right, the North starts making plans on how to get rid of the Confederate Army. Okay, a few days after Gettysburg, okay, Ulysses S. Grant, a general in the West, wins a huge battle in Vicksburg. So this is the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi, right? So there's Vicksburg down here in Mississippi, right here. Okay, so the Union, all right, they have a part of their plan is to capture the Mississippi River. And the Confederates, as early as 1862, had actually captured Frankfort in Kentucky after winning the Battle of Perryville. And they're pushing once again into northern territories. Effective Union resistance pushes them back, and they're able to kind of march down the Mississippi River and finally take New Orleans and basically cleave off Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas from the rest of the Union. Okay, the Union also decides to implement what is known as the Anaconda Plan. Okay, this was a full blockade of the southern coast. Remember that the North has a fantastic advantage in naval power. Okay, and is able to effectively keep any sort of goods from reaching southern port towns. Other goals of the Union Army, okay, besides blockading, is of course to capture Richmond, all right, destroy Atlanta and Savannah and break Southern morale, and then use their numerical advantage to break down the Confederate Army. Okay, so these are the 5 main goals of the Union beginning in 1863. It takes a little while for them to realize them, but doesn't take too long. Okay, General John Butler for the Union will be the general that is supposed to take Richmond. William Tecumseh Sherman, great historical name by the way, is the one that is supposed to take Atlanta and then drive to the coast and separate basically Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, and Alabama, and Tennessee from the other older colonies, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. Okay, and he does this quite well. Um, Grant will be to be promoted, first of all, into the leader of all Union forces on the East. Okay, and he'll earn this nickname known as the Busher. Okay, and it refers to his tendency to sacrifice large amounts of soldiers to win no matter what the cost. He doesn't care if he loses 15,000 troops to the South 7,000. He can replace them. Okay, and so when Lee moves back to Virginia to dig in, and basically his strategy is to make it so the Union's casualty rates are so high that the public in the North will be no longer willing to support. He's trying to call Grant's bluff. He's trying to see if Grant will truly be okay with losing as many people as he does. All right, and it's going to backfire. Lincoln is committed to ending the war at whatever cost, and Grant is willing to win the war at whatever cost. There have been 5 leaders before Grant in the first 2 years, first 2 or 3 years, and he finally is going to be different because he's willing to sacrifice casualties to win. Okay, he's not going to be willing to give up. His number one soldier is Tecumseh Sherman, and his goal and his job is going to take Atlanta, and he does so. He burns it to the ground, and he marches to Savannah. This is known as his March to the Sea, in which he just basically devastates the civilian population between Atlanta and Savannah. After reaching Savannah and destroying Savannah, he turns north and captures Columbia. So Sherman is going to be Grant's right-hand man, but notice how they're pretty ruthless, right? They don't wait, they give no quarter, and they keep marching their armies to their deaths as they push Lee further and further back. Little background on these guys. Robert E. Lee is going to be a Union soldier before the Civil War. He was actually chosen to lead the Union, but turns it down. Okay, he turns it down because he didn't think that he could raise a hand against his own home state. He had a higher duty to his home state of Virginia than he did to the government, the Union as a whole. Right, so he turns down this job to fight and lead the Confederates. He's born into wealth, one of the South's most prominent families, the son of a Revolutionary War hero, and his wife is the granddaughter of Martha Washington. He's brilliant. He's a brilliant military strategist. He's able to win so many battles, being outnumbered all through the Civil War. But really, he makes major blunders in attacking the North, and this is the only real area we can say that he shouldn't have done this at all. And really, he might have lost the war as a result of this. Stonewall Jackson is our other, probably the second most famous general in the Civil War. Intensely religious, a former professor at Virginia Military Institute, thought the Southern cause was sacred. And he was kind of like Grant in some ways in that he would drive his troops to exhaustion. He wouldn't listen to their complaints. And he was ruthless, okay? No regard to his own troops or the others. He was incredibly successful. He won 5 battles in a month, won a major battle at Chancellorsville, but during that battle he was actually shot by his own troops in friendly fire and died. So that was a massive, massive loss right before Lee could have used him in the fight to the north. Ulysses S. Grant was a soldier in the Mexican-American War. He wins 2 major battles in the Western Theater at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson before winning the turning point battle of the West, which was Vicksburg. And, you know, he is going to be that 6th and final military leader after Lincoln goes through 5 different commanders, mostly because they just don't seem to care about pursuing the Confederates. He decides on Grant because he knew that Grant wouldn't hesitate to chase the enemy to the bitter end. Okay. Once again, we've mentioned Sherman. Okay, he's Grant's most trusted officer. He's talkative. Is also a pretty brilliant strategist, and he also gets in the beginning that war is going to be very, very difficult. But his legacy in the South, right? And even to this day, if you ask about Sherman, you will in the areas of the South between Atlanta, Savannah and Columbia, he is looked on still with such intense hatred in those areas, right? So even though this is 150 years ago, Sherman is still a hated name, and his actions were seen as barbarous and unnecessary, and they were, to break the spirit of those who lived in rural Georgia and South Carolina. All right, last thing we need to do is talk about the end. The last major campaign will be the Siege of Petersburg. This is happening in 1864 and 1865. It's kind of an 8-month siege, and the Confederates try to break out of it. This is where we see a major use of trenches in the war. Okay, eventually the Confederates are able to break out of it, and Lee ends up running more or less to the west, retreating, trying to get entrenched in a position from which he can fight once again the Union with heavy casualties. All right, the last kind of final battle of the war is the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. Lee is trying to break out of Grant's chokehold. Confederates are able to push the Union back a bit, but 50,000 soldiers will be behind them as they continue to push. Jefferson Davis will evacuate from Richmond, and Confederate troops burn it to the ground so that the Union cannot capture anything there as contraband, and the Union will continue to advance. And so you see in this map, right, the Confederate line of march will be kind of head to the north. After Petersburg, right, they'll kind of march on the southern flank, and they kind of crisscross each other a bit here. Lee's retreat will go all the way back to Appomattox, and this will be the area where the Confederate Army will meet their end. And in fact, the reason why the Army truly dissolves is when they get to Appomattox, they have to get some food for the Army. At this point, the Confederate Army is no bigger than 25,000 troops. Men are deserting en masse. And there's a sense that it's all over, right? But they have to stop and forage for food because no food is provided at this stage. And Grant's, 120,000 plus troops are able to march in and basically surround Lee and capture him. Lee is forced to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Here's a graphic of that happening. There's Grant right there. There's Lee right there. But the terms of surrender were very generous. Confederate generals and soldiers were allowed to go home. They could take their horses, their sidearms, and personal possessions, right? And they would not be accused of treason. They wouldn't be hung for their actions in the war. They'd be granted full clemency and allowed to basically return to their homes, what was left of their homes, with no questions asked, all right? Now, at this point, slavery is outlawed in the South because of the Emancipation Proclamation, so much of the Southerners' wealth is gone. But the idea was to make sure that Southerners didn't have a reason to hate being back in the Union after it's all said and done. The North didn't want to decimate the South, except for potentially Sherman. They wanted the South to be brought back into the Union. Remember, the idea was to conquer and occupy it, not to create some sort of secondary country where the losers of the war would have this second class status. They're going to be American citizens again, and Grant and Lincoln realized that if we were to punish them too harshly, that there will always be antagonism between the two sections, and that's what caused the war in the first place. So that's all the fighting. Like I said, there's a lot more out there, a lot more battles we didn't even talk about. So I would go and look them up if you want to. Okay, it's pretty fascinating. There's literally libraries worth of information that has been written on this stuff. So look it up, and good luck on your questions. Let me know if you need anything. Thanks.